Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. This is Dr. Calloway, Principal Investigator, Copenhagen Research Initiative. I am recording this for the record, though I don't know whose record anymore. The experiment was designed to test the limits of observation, to study quantum superposition beyond microscopic constraint, to see if an event could remain in an undetermined state without collapsing into a fixed reality. It was meant to be controlled, measured, a step forward in understanding the nature of existence itself. At first, the results aligned with expectation. A particle, suspended between possibilities, neither choosing nor committing. Time behaved as it should. Equipment functioned within parameters. Data sets confirmed projections. But the moment stretched. The observation prolonged beyond what should have been possible. The particle did not resolve. The probability wave refused to collapse. We had assumed the act of watching would eventually force it into a decision. But the longer we observed, the more the laws we thought immutable began to erode. The problem wasn't the experiment itself. It was the assumption behind it. That we were the ones doing the observing. That reality remained neutral until we demanded it take form. That the mere act of human perception was enough to impose order. We were wrong. The audio feed distorts. A brief disruption. A repeated phrase loops for a fraction of a second before stabilizing. The same words, spoken in the same voice, but slightly misaligned. As if the recording had been made twice. As if another version of this log exists in parallel, bleeding through. We thought we were looking at reality, but it was looking back. The Copenhagen interpretation. The foundation of everything we believed to be true about quantum mechanics. It told us that the universe does not commit to a state until it is observed. That reality itself lingers in uncertainty, a blur of probabilities, waiting for an outside force to make a decision. But what if the observer isn't certain? What if observation itself is unstable? What if, instead of forcing reality to collapse into a single outcome, the act of looking could stretch that moment indefinitely? What if, by watching, we didn't resolve the uncertainty, but amplified it? The quantum isolation chamber was built to answer that question. A containment field designed to observe a quantum event without disturbing it. A controlled system where we could witness a particle in superposition without collapsing it into one defined reality. If successful, we would hold an event in suspension, indefinitely unresolved. The first test was simple. A single electron, isolated in the chamber, left undisturbed under direct but passive observation. No external force, no interference, just the machine watching. The readings returned impossible values. The electron remained both here and elsewhere for longer than physics should allow. Seconds passed. Then minutes. The event refused to resolve. It should have chosen a state by then, should have adhered to every principle we understood. But it didn't. It stayed caught between. We were ecstatic. The implications were staggering. Proof that reality could be held in uncertainty beyond the microscopic level. That observation wasn't just a passive act, but an active force that could shape the very nature of existence. The team erupted in celebration, every mind in the room grasping at the magnitude of what we had just achieved. The elation was brief. The first inconsistency appeared in the logs. A timestamp that shouldn't exist. A fragment of an audio file that wasn't recorded, at least not by us. A voice. My voice. Flat. Measured. But wrong. We never built the machine. I stared at the screen. The log didn't match the sequence of recorded events. The date was impossible. A full year before the chamber had been designed, before the project had even been greenlit. The playback repeated. The same phrase. The same voice. The same certainty. We never built the machine. I turned to my colleagues, expecting confusion, disbelief, anything. But no one else reacted. No one seemed to notice. A glitch, I told myself. An error in the logging software. The chamber's electromagnetic field interfering with the data feed. A simple malfunction. But something in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. Because I remembered saying those words. Not here. Not in this moment. But somewhere. In some version of my memory that didn't quite align with the present. A recollection that shouldn't exist, layered over my thoughts like an echo. The next test proceeded as planned. Another quantum event, another suspended state. The results held. The particle remained unresolved, balanced on the edge of probability longer than any recorded experiment before it. The team was thrilled. Papers would be written. Awards granted. Theoretical physics rewritten. But something was wrong. A coffee cup. A simple object placed absent-mindedly on the control desk. Full 1 second. Empty the next. No one had touched it. No one had moved. I stared at it, waiting for my mind to correct itself, to fill in whatever lapse had occurred in my perception. But nothing changed. A moment later, a colleague reached for the cup, hesitated, and frowned. Their hand hovered over it, uncertainty twisting in their expression. Did I already drink this? They shook their head, dismissed the thought, and moved on. I wanted to do the same. But I couldn't. The coffee cup should have been empty. I watched it being drained, the last drop swallowed, the ceramic placed carelessly on the desk. But the moment my eyes left it, just for a second, it was full again. No movement. No hand replacing it. No sound of liquid being poured. Just a simple, quiet contradiction. I reached for it, hesitated. My fingers brushed against the surface, warm, as if freshly filled. I checked the desk for another cup, some explanation for the mistake. There was none. Someone spoke behind me, their voice low, uncertain. We talked about this already. I turned. One of the assistants, eyes flicking across the room as if searching for something just out of reach. What? The changes to the data logs, they said. We already discussed them. Yesterday. Or, I think it was yesterday. I hadn't had that conversation. I was sure of it. But the way they said it, the certainty laced with hesitation, sent something cold through me. They weren't just confused. They were remembering something that had never happened. I started checking the records myself, combing through every line, every timestamp, looking for errors. The logs were intact. The timestamps matched. The data confirmed everything we had done. But the blueprints didn't. The designs of the quantum isolation chamber had been finalized months ago, every detail locked in, reviewed, approved. But the files on my screen weren't the ones I remembered. The structure had changed. Minor at first, an adjusted sequence, a shift in the wiring pathways. But the deeper I looked, the worse it became. Entire sections rewritten. Features I knew we hadn't added. Components I had no memory of designing. Yet there they were. Every modification logged. Every change accounted for. Not a single note of discussion about any of it. I sat back, breathing too shallow, too fast. My hands were shaking. Fatigue. Observer bias. Stress. I had to be imagining it. I told myself that. I told myself again and again. And then someone disappeared. Not died. Not quit. Not reassigned. Gone. Their desk sat empty, their chair tucked neatly beneath it, as if they had just stepped away for a moment. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. The others weren't reacting the way they should. Some glanced at the empty space, a flicker of confusion in their expressions before they turned back to their work. I asked. I said their name, waited for the response that would make this normal. One person frowned. Who? Another hesitated. They worked with us, I insisted, something sharp creeping into my voice. You know that. The hesitation deepened, uncertainty pooling in their eyes. I don't think they did. A pause. But I remember their face. That was the worst part. Not a blank absence, not an outright denial, just fragments of recognition that didn't fit together. Some swore the person had never been here. Others knew them, remembered working alongside them, but not their name, not their voice, not the sound of their laugh or the way they spoke. I remembered both versions at once. I remembered them existing and not existing, the memories layered over each other, refusing to reconcile. I checked the records. There was nothing. No employment history, no ID badge, no signed agreement. Their name didn't appear in a single file. But in an old security log, there they were. Standing in the corridor outside the lab, looking directly into the camera. Their mouth moved, forming words. I turned up the volume. Static swallowed the sound, distorting it, shredding the clarity. I played it again. Slowed it down. The words came through, clear this time. Don't look at me. The file corrupted before my eyes. The air in the lab was thick with something unspoken. No one wanted to be the first to say it. No one wanted to be the one to acknowledge that whatever was happening, it was slipping further beyond our control. But we continued. Because that's what scientists do. We observe. We measure. We push forward, even when the ground beneath us starts to shift. The next test was designed for certainty. A controlled observation of a physical object on a macroscopic scale. No ambiguity. No abstract probabilities. A simple ball bearing placed within the quantum isolation chamber, subjected to passive observation. It would either remain still or move. A binary state. A simple outcome. It did neither. The moment the chamber was activated, the readings became incomprehensible. The ball bearing was rotating clockwise. Simultaneously, it was rotating counterclockwise. Not alternating. Not fluctuating. Both directions at once, layered over each other, refusing to resolve. It wasn't an error. It wasn't a malfunction. We were looking directly at it, and it was showing us two outcomes at once. One of the researchers stepped closer to the observation glass, staring, mouth slightly open, hands tightening into fists. The others did the same, drawn toward it like the answer might be hiding in plain sight, like sheer force of will could impose order onto something that no longer obeyed it. I was the last to approach. I leaned in, just enough to see my own reflection in the glass. And that's when everything came apart. The person in the glass was me. The same face, the same stance. But something was missing. Some vital thread between us had frayed. I lifted my hand. The reflection did not. I stopped breathing. I lifted my other hand, a slow, deliberate movement. Nothing. The reflection just stood there, staring back at me, motionless. Someone called my name. I turned. My reflection did not. I stumbled away, breaking the sight line, hands shaking. The others hadn't noticed. They were still staring into the chamber, eyes locked on the impossibility inside, too transfixed to see what had just happened. I looked again. The reflection was back to normal, moving as it should, mirroring every twitch, every motion, every nervous breath. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, but I hadn't. Something had looked at me through the glass, and for a moment it had forgotten to pretend to be me. I checked the logs. The test had lasted 5 minutes, but the recording was 3 hours long. I played it back, scrolling through footage of a room I had never seen before, filled with shadows that stretched at wrong angles, figures standing in corners where there should have been empty space. The sound was off. No voices. No ambient noise. Just the low hum of the machines, stretched and distorted. But near the end, something changed. I was on the screen. Sitting exactly where I was now, same chair, same posture. But the feed was still running. The timestamp was from an hour ahead. I watched myself. The future version of me leaned forward and spoke. At first, there was nothing but static. The words were layered over themselves, too many voices saying too many things at once. The distortion cut in, the feedback looping, collapsing in on itself until, finally, one voice emerged. Mine. Clear. Precise. Stop the experiment. Before it sees you. The log ended. I checked the date. It wasn't from today. It wasn't from this year. The file had been created 3 years before the project even existed. We moved to shut it down. No hesitation. No discussion. Whatever we had been searching for, whatever answers we had wanted, none of it mattered anymore. The machine had to be stopped. Someone reached for the main power switch. Their hand hovered for a moment, then froze. It wasn't there. Not broken. Not disabled. Just missing. I pushed past them, scanning the control panel, fingers moving across every familiar surface, every switch, every dial. I had designed this layout myself. I knew every component, every function. I knew where the shutdown sequence was supposed to be. But the panel was wrong. I turned to the others, my pulse hammering in my ears. I asked if someone had made modifications. No one answered. I looked again, slower this time, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. There was no evidence that a shutdown switch had ever existed. No markings. No wiring. No gaps where a control might have once been. The blueprints would confirm it. They had to. I pulled them up on the screen. 2 versions overlapped. The original schematics, just as I remembered, just as they had been signed off and approved. And another version, layered over it, merging and separating at random, as if the system couldn't decide which was real. The second design had no failsafe, no emergency cutoff, no way to stop what had been set into motion. I staggered back. Someone swore under their breath. The others just stood there, staring at the screen, the confusion shifting into something worse. A noise cut through the room. Soft at first, like distant feedback, an uneven hum that crawled into the edges of perception. Someone else was standing in the doorway. It took me too long to understand what I was seeing. A member of the team, one of the researchers who had vanished. Their posture was rigid, their face expressionless, their breath coming too slow, too steady. They stepped forward, just once, and then they spoke. The words came out before their lips moved. A full second of sound before their mouth even began to form the shape of the first syllable. The mismatch was subtle at first, but the delay widened, stretching impossibly, like sound and motion had lost their connection to one another. The others pulled away. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask if they were all right, if they remembered where they had been, if they knew how long they had been gone. But I couldn't, because their shadow wasn't following them. It stayed in the doorway, a perfect silhouette frozen in place. I looked back at their face. Their mouth was still moving, still forming words that didn't match the sounds coming out of them. The hum in the room deepened, vibrating against my bones. The figure took another step. The shadow did not. Then, without warning, their entire body fragmented. Not shattered. Not crumpled. Just gone. A distortion of static where they had been. Then nothing at all. The hum stopped. The others were silent. No one reached for the space where they had stood. No one moved toward the doorway. No one spoke. I forced my breath into something steady, turned back to the logs, needing something tangible, something concrete to hold on to. But the records had changed. My own entries conflicted with each other. One log said the chamber had been operational for 6 months. Another said it had never been activated at all. I opened an audio file, my own voice filling the room. But the next file was different. The same words, the same sentences, but stacked on top of themselves, slightly out of sync. A delay of milliseconds, then seconds, then full minute. It was me. And it wasn't. I tried to remember what I had said, what I had recorded, which version was real. But I couldn't. It was all slipping. The experiment wasn't contained anymore. It had never been contained. It had never been controlled. It had never been ours. We had assumed we were the observers, forcing reality to bend under our gaze. But we weren't the only ones watching. Something had been waiting, caught between the splintered moments, slipping through gaps we never should have created. It had seen us before we ever saw it, and it was still watching. There was only one way out. I had spent too much time trying to understand, trying to control it, trying to force logic onto something that had long since slipped free of reason. Every attempt to fix it, to stabilize what had been set in motion, had only made things worse. Each observation splintered reality further, expanding the fracture lines, multiplying the contradictions. The answer had been in front of me all along. The first observation. It was the catalyst. The moment the experiment began, the moment the wave function refused to collapse, the moment we invited something into a space where nothing should have been. If I could undo that, erase the first divergence, collapse all possibilities into a single path, I could set things right. I could go back. I could stop myself. There was no time to question it. No time to hesitate. I tore through the logs, digging for an entry point, searching for a way to send a message to the past, something strong enough to cut through the noise, to reach myself before I ever stepped into that lab, before I ever built that machine. The system was barely holding together. Files shifted, rewritten before my eyes. Dates no longer adhered to any meaningful sequence. Some timestamps were from decades ago, others from years yet to come. I ignored it, forced my focus onto the one thing that mattered. The message. I had to keep it simple, direct. No explanations, no theories, no hesitation. I pressed record. My own voice filled the empty space, shaking, breath uneven. You have to close the box. That was all. I encoded it, buried it deep, set it on a reverse loop, forcing it to transmit backwards through the corrupted channels, threading it through the same impossible fractures that had let this thing seep in. And I sent it. Everything stopped. The lab dissolved. The walls, the machines, the air itself unraveled in an instant, as if none of it had ever been real. The weight in my chest lifted, the pressure in my skull released. The hum that had lingered at the edge of hearing, the whisper of something watching, waiting, it all vanished. And I woke up. The morning light stretched across the floor, warm against my skin. A familiar rhythm played from the clock radio, the faint hum of traffic outside, the muted voices of people going about their day. It was normal. I sat up, feeling the solidity of the bed beneath me, the steady beat of my own pulse, the simple, ordinary passage of time. There was no lab, no experiment, no impossible observations, no missing people. It had worked. I let out a slow breath, ran a hand through my hair, grounding myself in the sheer simplicity of the moment. The nightmare was over. I had stopped it before it could begin. I had erased it completely. I was safe. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, just existing in a space that finally made sense. The feeling of solid ground beneath my feet. The weight of my own body, steady and defined, not slipping between states, not uncertain. No hum at the edge of hearing. No shifting blueprints, no missing people. Just the ordinary quiet of a morning like any other. I let out a breath, deep and steady, the kind that pulls everything back into place. It was over. The lab, the machine, the experiment, all of it gone. I had done it. I had rewritten the sequence, cut the loop before it could form. There was nothing left of it. Nothing left of me from that other place, that other version of event. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was real. I was here. I was safe. I stood and stretched, letting my muscles shake off the weight of exhaustion. My gaze drifted toward the mirror across the room. And my reflection didn't move. The relief collapsed in an instant. My breath caught, my muscles locking in place. I lifted a hand. The reflection stood still. I took a step forward. It didn't. The room shrank around me, the walls pressing closer, my pulse hammering against my ribs. No, this wasn't happening. Not here. Not now. I had undone it. I had erased it. It was over. I turned my head slowly, listening, straining for any sound. And then I heard it. My own voice. Close. Right next to my ear. I wasn't speaking. My lips hadn't moved. My lungs hadn't pushed the air. But I heard it all the same. You never left. I spun, searching for the source, for anything, anyone. But I was alone. The walls warped, stretched, folding in ways that didn't belong to this world. The room pulsed, dissolving at the edges, unraveling, splitting apart into fragments of things that should not exist at the same time, things that had never been and things that always were. I stumbled backward, gripping the desk for balance, for something tangible, something real. But nothing was real anymore. I turned back to the mirror. The reflection smiled. And then I wasn't in my room. I was standing in the lab again, in front of the machine, watching my own hand reach for the controls. My movements were effortless, practiced. The actions of someone who had done this before. Someone who had never stopped doing this. No matter what I had changed. No matter how far I had run. The loop had never been broken. I heard my own voice, steady, certain, coming from my own mouth. We have to know. I pressed the switch. The screen filled with static. The walls shattered into 1,000 mirrored versions of themselves, splitting and colliding, folding and unfolding across infinite planes of existence. Everything collapsed. Everything began again. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.